In many countries today, we depend on schools to play a big role in turning babies into successful adults. But for most of human existence, there weren't any schools, but still everyone was learning every day, all the time. And babies turned into adults. Food was grown, traditions were created and passed on, and all of this happened without schools. My guest today is Dr. Barbara Rogoff. She's an expert in how people learn in families and communities. She spent time in cultures around the world, and she studies indigenous cultural practices. The field of the learning sciences has been deeply influenced by her research and her theories, and I'm really honored to have her on the show. Barbara, welcome on The Science of Learning.
Thank you, Keith. It's great to be here.
Well, to start out, I know you've been around the world and studying families and communities, but close to home here in the United States, can you give an example of a child learning something in a family or a community?
Oh, sure. If we start with the beginning, um, little ones are learning to their first language by just being a part of what's going on around them. And they hear people speaking and they want to join in, especially because they notice that if they use words, they will get something done that they want. Maybe somebody will give them the bottle or whatever. So that is really impressive learning that happens within the first couple years of life without schooling being the way that the children learn. They're just a part of things. They're motivated to learn and they pick up what's around them.
Right. I think that's a great example. You mean just language. Like if we're
Mhm.
learning to speak English, we don't go to a class and listen to lectures about how to speak in English, right?
Well, some families speak to children in a teacherly way, even at age one, but over human life in all around the world and generally, kids are learning without that kind of teacherly way of helping them learn.
So what other way is there? I mean, how do communities and families structure those environments so that children can learn?
Well, that's a really important question. And I think it's important to think of it as not just something random that the kids and families do, but the families and communities include children in the activities that they're engaged in. And the children are paying attention. They want to join in. And I call that learning by observing and pitching in to family and community endeavors. It's LOPI for short. And I've learned about it by being involved in indigenous communities of the Americas, where that is a prominent way of learning. And the communities are organized in a way to facilitate that.
Oh, is this true of all communities, or can you give an example of one of these indigenous communities that you've been in and studied?
Sure, but it is the case for all communities that people learn that way. The example I would give of children learning their first language, that's by observing and pitching in. And it happens everywhere, but it seems to be more prominent in a lot of indigenous communities in the Americas. And I have worked in a Mayan community in Guatemala for 51 years. I hesitate to name the number, but in that community, the families and communities include the children in everyday activities, and the children they, like children everywhere, are eager to be a part of things. And the families support that. So they're not sending the children off to play while they get their work done, and they're not trying to do their chores while the child is asleep. They are looking towards including the children, and part of what their goal is for children to learn to pay attention to what's going on around them and learn how to be community minded. In other words, pitching in to help and becoming aware of what's needed and how to do it. And that's from the early I've heard people say from the time a child can walk, which is usually about 12 months. Um, so it's very early. It's a support for children being present and participating.
So 51 years ago. So tell me, this is true. When you were there, these children were at home all the time, all day long, so they were not leaving and going to school. Is that right?
No, in back then, about three-quarters of the kids went to school through about third grade. But they weren't just hanging out at home. The children were involved with community events. They were involved with older children. Sometimes they went to the lakeshore while they're with their moms who were washing clothes at the lakeshore, or with their dads working in the fields, or just with an older sibling or a cousin looking around town to see what was happening. So there was a freedom of movement and inclusion that was much more common then than there is now.
Right. Well, I remember even here, say talking to my wife, or not so much with me, but I remember my wife telling stories about things she learned at home, just about being in the kitchen and learning how to cook certain dishes. You don't sit down at the table and have your mother lecture at you. You don't have a textbook about doing things. So uh, it seems like you're talking about that sort of thing where
Yeah.
you're participating in the activity. You're not passive, right? You're active in some way.
Yeah, you're doing what you can to help. And even with the very little kids who often make more work for their moms, the mothers are welcoming that in the LOPI way of doing things and in indigenous communities, many of them in the Americas. The children's help might not be so helpful, but the parents regard it as both help that the children are providing and important for the children's development, for them to be participating, even if it's yields some inefficiencies for the parents getting the work done.
Right, right. Yeah, it takes you longer to do it to help someone who doesn't know what they're doing than if you just went and did it yourself. So that I think people in the workplace have that experience too. It's apprenticeship, right? If you have an apprentice working with you, teaching them how to do it. And I know from your own writing, you've used that concept of apprenticeship. Is that right?
Yeah, I used it as the title of a book that I wrote some years back, Apprenticeship and Thinking, as a way of thinking about how children learn and develop. It's sort of alongside the people around them.
Right, right. So is it, I don't know, when I hear apprenticeship, I think about a machine shop or automotive shop, right? Where you're, uh, I don't know if teaching is the right word. I mean, teaching, quote unquote, doesn't quite seem like what's going on.
Yeah, you gave the example of cooking also. So it's not like there's a manual that the parents are marching the child through, or a recipe that is telling the child exactly what to do. The children are just a part of things, and the adults in a machine shop as well. There's work that's showing how children who hang around their parents who are mechanics, for instance, um, begin to help out. I just saw a TikTok showing 1 year olds who were handing their an adult a tool that they needed, or even under the car, who uh, trying to help out. And in some cases, they were helpful, and in some cases, maybe the whoever posted the TikTok just thought it was cute. But they can get something for somebody. Here, hand me that wrench, and the child, it's a help if you're under the car and you can't reach it. And the child is learning at the same time, oh, this is what the wrench is, or that's when Uncle uses the wrench. Um, so yeah, it's being present, being involved, and seeing how things work in context. So a lot of school is out of the context of the information and skills that are being taught. But in everyday life, a lot of what we learn is we learn about the context in which we use that information and skill as well. And so children who have a chance to be present when something's happening they don't need as much explanation for what's going on because they can see it and be part of it.
Yeah, all of the situations we're talking about are physical, are bodily, right? Embodied. You can see what's going on, like it's cooking or it's working on a car. It's seems like very
Or
different from
working
this.
at a computer.
Oh, really? So you think you can see
Sure.
things that are going on? So give me an example of how that works at a computer.
Okay, well, I'll give you an example that comes to mind about one of my grandkids who was watching in a very literate family, watching how people use books. And one of their parents was an author. And the child at age 3, I have a little video of them holding up a journal that their parent had written an article in and pretending to read it. But they knew what reading was, they knew what writing was, they knew they had all kinds of books in the image behind them. They've been surrounded by literacy, and not just at the moment of watching their parent write something, but the way everybody around them talks about, oh, I have to work on my writing and I'm stuck at this spot. The kids can hear that. So it's being involved in fact, I think that some of the things that are not so physically carried are especially well carried in by participation and observing other people. And an example I'll give of that is students, undergraduate students, who have a chance to be working in the lab with other students, graduate students, and the researcher. They have a chance to learn what's involved in research. They see that learning statistics is useful because it's used in trying to convince somebody of what they're finding in the lab. Many people have said in order to learn math and statistics, it is so helpful to have a use for it. Well, that use often comes in pitching into something beyond you that math or statistics is useful for. Like for that little 3-year-old, learning that math is part of what their parent was using in that article, which I'm sure they knew. They got very interested in math, and it became it people say they learn it more deeply if they're involved in using it than just hearing about it, which is what often happens in a class is you just hear about something. You're not actually embedded in using it.
Right? I like that embedded in using it. And I think that connects to, you've said several times this word participation or participating. And to me, that seems very different from what happens in most school classrooms, where I don't imagine, seems like sitting there and listening doesn't seem like participating. So say more about that. What do you mean by participation?
Well, in the case of LOPI, participation means both being present and being allowed to contribute. So it's the kind of observation that kids do that is that's something I think is built in to really early childhood. So having a chance to observe things that matter, which is what the family's doing and the community's doing, they can pick things up. And in fact, some parents have learned that they better be careful how they speak around their little kid because the kids are listening and they may begin to use the words that their parents let slip sometimes. um, Kids are very observant. What happens in LOPI is that observation is encouraged, and children are in situations that allow for their participation, encourage their participation, and by participation I mean being a part of it, having a role, contributing, bringing the wrench to somebody who's working on a car. That's a form of participation. Being an active observer is also part of participation. sometimes people think of observation as being something kind of passive. Not in LOPI. It people are keenly observing, and they're seeing what's going on around them. I think that gets shut down in some school settings because the teacher may say, don't pay attention to what's going on around you, just pay attention to me. And so the students are learning to narrow their attention. And that's different in a LOPI situation where students are encouraged to be aware of what's going on around them as a way of fostering the opportunities to participate, the likelihood that they might have something to contribute. I don't know if that gets at participation, but um, gives a feel for it, maybe.
Yeah, I think I get it. It's a kind of engaged observation because you have to make choices about what you're looking at, right? You have to know what's important, but you don't quite know yet because you're still learning. Uh, so that's an active kind of observing, as opposed to when you're in a classroom. You know, you're always looking at the teacher, even if the teacher's boring and not worth looking at, right?
And even if you let your eyes kind of blur, so it just looks like you're looking at the teacher. But in LOPI, the kind of observation is with interest, with involvement in the looking. Um, and that is something that is encouraged in communities that make a lot of use of LOPI. But I think we all come with that from the beginning. It can be discouraged in children by not having them in places where something interesting is happening, or by actively asking them not to observe.
Right, right. So we've talked a lot about families so far, but I know in your research you also looked at communities, broader networks, and what you call practices that result in a kind of a reproduction over time of culturally valued practices that wouldn't be just one family. So, can you give an example of that, something that would be very important, like a tradition to a community that gets, I guess you could say, passed on?
Yeah, let me say though that it's not just reproduction of the current practices of a community. Each person who's contributing has the likelihood that they're going to do it a little differently. And sometimes those differences are taken up by others. So you might find another way to do things. So the participation is not just a reproduction of the way things are already done, but it includes innovation and invention of new ways to do things. And I think we've all noticed how much difference the young generation has in changing the practices of the community, any community. And it's there's both learning the current practices and putting a twist on them. And the twist on it might make everybody change in that direction. So how the community supports the children learning and innovating the practices of the community includes expectations for the children to be paying attention and to help without being asked. It also includes the children having the opportunities to do that and the support in doing it. And that's not just what families decide to do. That is the expectations of a community, whether the children are even allowed to be present. Think about children in workplaces in the United States. It's very rare. In fact, a lot of workplaces don't allow it. In That really restricts the children's opportunities to learn about their parents' work, about the kind of ethics of work, about what's involved in different um, skills and professions and practices. So the community role is partly in the expectations that children have something to offer and they can learn, and making it possible for the kids to be present and involved, and appreciating the kids' involvement, even if it makes more work for the parents. And that is especially in the very early years. By the time children are 7 or 8, and they might be able to be more useful, if they've been excluded from helping when they're 1 or 2, they've learned helping without being asked is not something that I'm supposed to do. And so by the time they're 7 or 8 or 9, they don't want to do it. And so parents are kind of stuck having to kind of convince the kids to be involved in a middle class setting where the kids have often been discouraged from being involved as little kids. In communities that are quite involved with LOPI, the children are included, they're participating, and their efforts are appreciated. There's a kind of trust that the children have something to offer rather than an exclusion of the children. And in those settings, the children just over their early years develop more skill and more interest in helping without being asked. So it's a very different circumstance from middle class life to life that is organized around LOPI in the extent to which children show initiative in being helpful.
Right. Oh, can you remind us again of what does LOPI stand for?
Yeah, LOPI is short for learning by observing and pitching in to family and community endeavors. It's
Right.
just a
It's
description of what I saw very commonly, and I continue to see in a number of indigenous communities and indigenous heritage communities in the United States and throughout the Americas.
right, right. I remember, I think that you've done a pretty large study of weaving practices. Is that right? Where it can be fairly complicated to to do this sort of weaving, and it takes a fairly long amount of time to pick up that practice.
Well, the place where weaving plays a role in my learning is that when I first got to this community, Mayan community in Guatemala, I came in with the idea that people learn by being taught. And that I had spent many years in school by then. I was a graduate student. And I noticed that the children were very skilled in a number of ways in this Mayan town. One of them was weaving. By the time a girl was maybe 8 or 9, she's able to weave. Maybe not the most complex patterns or fabrics, but she's already skilled with using this complex technology. And there were other examples of complex things that the kids were very good at. So I asked their mothers, how did you teach your daughters to weave? And the mothers would say, we don't teach them, they learn. And I didn't have a way of thinking about that at first. And but I realized it was a really important puzzle. So that's where I began to pay attention to how the kids were learning by observing and pitching in to family endeavors, community activities. And I also paid attention to what the adults were doing. They were not doing nothing. They were in support of the girls learning to weave. For instance, at about age 4, 5, 6, the little girls, this is years ago, this is not so much the practice anymore in this town. Um, the little girls would make their own play loom. The older little girls would help the younger little girls make a loom out of a blade of a plant. It's a long part, and then they would find little bits of thread and bring that and set up their own play loom. And they would practice a little bit that way, and the mothers would notice when they began to do that. That was a cue for the mothers that the child was interested. That's when the mothers would begin to provide some support for children learning uh, learning weaving that was not with a play loom, but with a real loom. So they were paying attention to the little girl's interest in weaving, and then they would set up a loom for the girl. So the girl is not having to set up this very complex loom that is the mature form of weaving. Instead, the mother was setting up, and the child was just doing a part of the activity of weaving, with the mother beside her or an older sister beside her, who would give tips in the process of weaving. So it was the weaving thing, the skill of the kids in weaving gave me a puzzle. And then I started paying attention to what the children were doing, what the mothers were doing, how they were interacting around the children learning to weave. And so then by a few years later, the children were skilled in weaving. The daughters were skilled in weaving.
I'm still fascinated by that phrase. They told you, we don't teach them, they learn.
Mhm.
It's like blowing my mind. But then you
It blew
analyze what
mine
was
too.
right. If only we could somehow figure out how to do that.
Well, what was part of the puzzle is I knew they weren't learning on their own, because this is a technology that has been developed over centuries. It's complex. I tried to do the weaving, and I already had a little bit of background in weaving. It was not something I caught on to. I would have had to be involved in the same ways those girls are for quite a while before I would pick up how to use the technology. So it's not like the children just learn by discovery. The children learn by being involved. And the mothers, when they said, we don't teach them, they weren't saying, we don't help them. They were saying, we don't do that schooly kind of explanation. We don't act like the school teachers do. That's what they meant when they said, we don't teach them. But they were doing a lot of supporting, including paying attention to what the kids were interested in, and helping the kids learn um, something something that relates to this that we've found in a lot of interviews with Mexican heritage moms in the US is the idea that it needs to come from the heart. The children's involvement, the children's help needs to come from the heart. Nace del corazón. And it means the moms that told us that, which was a large proportion of the Mexican heritage moms that we interviewed, um, they were saying, we don't make them do stuff. We pay attention to when they're interested and we support them. So we include them, and we appreciate and support their contribution so that they learn to do it from the heart. And that was something that we heard from many mothers, especially indigenous heritage mothers who are immigrants from Mexico in the United States.
Right. I guess it is, again, this example of learning a language. No one teaches them how to speak it, but they learn it. And they
And they
learn it
wouldn't
in,
learn it on their own. They
right,
wouldn't learn it
exactly.
without being involved. Yeah.
Right. It's fundamentally a community practice.
Mhm.
Right. Is there some way to connect this to learning of school materials? So I can see how all of these things,
Mhm.
you're doing stuff together, you're sitting next to a loom, you're watching someone weave something, then you sit there and you weave it. But now you're learning how to do algebra or you're learning how to write an essay. You're doing that, modern school stuff, and we've got to learn that. I believe we need to learn those things. And you have this very interesting title of Apprenticeship and Thinking. So I think you clearly believe that we can apply these principles to the more abstract school type of stuff. So, yeah, so help us understand that. How do you get from these kind of community based practices to schooling kinds of knowledge?
There are schools that have a structure that's similar to learning by observing and pitching in. And in this case, it would be not to family endeavors, but to school endeavors. And there are not that many of them, but the ones that use something like LOPI tend to have a collaborative structure where kids and adults and kids and adults work together on things that they're mutually interested in. It has a collaborative structure. And I was involved with a public school in Salt Lake City for some years that was organized with children helping to develop what the curriculum would be with the teachers, with adult volunteers in the classroom, and they would collaborate with other kids. They collaborated with the adults. There was a togetherness between what the adults were doing and the kids were doing. And some of the teachers in that school were new to this way of doing things. And they reported, actually, we wrote a book together about it, and they wrote in the book, it's called Learning Together, Children and Adults in a School Community. So in that book, some of the new teachers wrote part of what they had to do to teach in a collaborative way was to stop trying to control everything. Because part of teacher education is how classroom control. And that gets in the way of collaborating. So in order to learn to collaborate, they had to let go of some of their teacher training, which was how to control kids, and instead include kids, support kids. It's not like the kids were in charge. The teachers were still guiding what was happening. So the kids were very skilled. I can give an example in a fourth and fifth grade classroom. They were learning about probability in their math portion of the curriculum, and they decided together that they would have a Las Vegas day. And so the a few parent volunteers were there, and they wore that kind of visor that Las Vegas dealers wear, and they played games of probability. And one day, well, at a point in the day, the principal stopped by, and she was not very understanding of this way of learning. And she said, "What's going on here?" Because she saw the kids betting. And the kids came over and they said, "Oh, we're learning about probability. It is part of the state core curriculum." And she said, "Oh, okay, well then." And so this collaborative approach, the kids were interested, the adults were interested. There was a way of bringing in something abstract like probability in a way that the kids were engaged in exploring it, in using it, and they even knew about the state core curriculum in the process.
Oh, I love that example. I wrote a book called The Creative Classroom, and I advocate a pedagogy I call guided improvisation. And I was inspired by something I think you call it guided participation, right? Where it's a collaboration between the teacher and the students, but the teachers still have the more responsibility. I mean, after all, you are the teacher, but that doesn't mean that you're controlling. Uh, uh, Being the guider. So, how do you manage that? How do you be the person who's got a little bit more responsibility, but you're still not the controller? What would you say to a teacher? What's your advice?
Well, both for teachers and for parents, it is a process of guidance rather than control. And I'm thinking of a chapter in the book written by a teacher who was a fifth and sixth grade teacher, and she wrote about creating curriculum with children. So there's collaboration right there, but it's guidance. And part of what she was saying is that it's a process of improvisation. So they would have a circle in the morning, and the kids would say, here's what happened at my house over the weekend or whatever. And if they brought up something that would be uh, valuable for the kids to learn more about, she would throw over whatever she had planned for that morning, and they would start exploring it. So, like, one kid broke his leg, and he came in with a cast on. And they used that to explore uh, medical medical anatomy, the medical professions, the disability issues that this child was going to have getting around the classroom. There was a whole curriculum that developed around one kid breaking his leg. And another example is another child went on a trip to Europe with her family. And while she was away, the teacher used that as a way of having the kids learn about like time zones. Like if we're going, what is that? What is our classmate doing right now? Oh, it's nighttime where she is. And so building on the what the kids are interested in the moment to get the curriculum to be aligned with what the kids are interested in a collaborative way. So she would, um, like with the broken leg thing, she would brainstorm with the kids, what could we be learning about here? And say one kid's parent was a nurse. So that kid could say, oh, maybe my mom could come in and talk with us about how the bones are in that part of the leg where the child broke the leg. So there would be resources that the kids would bring to the curriculum, and it was all based on collaboration, and improvisation was an important part of that. That
Oh,
that was written. That was one of the chapters, and I love that chapter from the Learning Together book.
right. The book is called Learning Together. I love it. Uh, so, what is your conception of learning? My sense is that you have a somewhat different conception of learning. It's not that uh, information is being acquired in someone's brain or that some cognitive structures are developing behind your eyeballs. So, yeah, how would you define learning?
Yeah, I see learning as a process of changing participation. It means, well, brains are important, and so are the eyeballs, and so is the rest of the body, and so is the context in which people are engaged. So if I think about learning to read, for instance, it's not just figuring out how to decode stuff, but how are you interested in learning something? Have you figured out how the letters move across the page? Or and it's a process of, at first the children don't know that in English we move our eyes left to right. Um, but they observe people doing that, and people guide them by putting a finger on the page and moving across the page, guiding the child's involvement. But before long, the child doesn't need help with that. They've got it. And that is a change in the child's participation in reading. So I think of it as learning as a process of transforming our participation in whatever the activity is that we're trying to learn or trying to teach somebody.
So, whatever it is that's inside your mind is always embedded in that, I guess, community based participation. Is that what you mean?
It all goes together. It all goes together. Your brain is active, your body's active, the people around you are active. Even what's happening in your community is something that is it can be changing. So paying attention to what the expectations are. So if you're in first grade, the community supports for reading are very different than if you're in sixth grade. And so knowing what the supports are from the community, from the environment, that's an important part of understanding what learning is.
Right, right.
None of
And
us
you're
would be learning to, sorry, none of us would be learning to read if there weren't books or other written forms. It's a process that involves both our brains and our interest. Well, both, more than one thing. Our brains, our interest, the people around us guiding us, the things that we're involved with. It's all together. It's mutual.
and your research has been influential all the way up through high school, even into college. So it's not just preschoolers watching their parents making bread, right? Yeah, I'm thinking of engineering school where you have project-based learning teams, or we just talked about apprentices in automotive repair shops. I mean, they're not maybe they are 8-year olds, but they're not 4-year olds, and a lot of them are 18-year olds. So this is influential research for any age. It could be something advanced engineering. So it's been influential for all types of fairly advanced knowledge. And I love that you called your book Apprenticeship in Thinking, that it's not always something that you're doing with your hands, but it goes all the way into the most abstract kind of knowledge.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how graduate students learn to do research. They're learning by being involved in an endeavor that's bigger than them. They have the opportunity to see how other graduate students, how their professors are involved in research. And it is a process of learning by observing and pitching in to this endeavor of doing research. And in the process, they need to learn statistics. In most fields, they need to be familiar with statistics. And it becomes much easier once they're using it to be exploring a question that they have in their research or watching other people use it in their research. So it applies, I think, even maybe even more to what you're calling abstract thinking. I have some difficulty dividing things into abstract and not abstract. But in all forms of learning, I think observing and pitching in, if we could organize lives around that more than we do in middle class life, we'd have deeper learning. We'd have people being more interested in what they're doing. And I think, especially for young people who are often excluded from being a part of things, there would be a more of a sense of belonging and appreciation for what they offer if they're actually allowed to contribute rather than seen as just recipients of the the information that somebody is trying to force them to learn.
Right, right. Well, I always end the interviews by asking, uh, what's one thing that you really want people to know about learning?
One thing that I want people to know about learning: it's an active process. It includes us all. Even the people who think they're done learning are not done learning. Um, we keep on being guided by our interests, by other people, by the things that we're trying to accomplish. And I think that extends from the earliest years through the latest years. I'm still learning a whole lot about writing. I look at my writing now versus 4 years ago. It's deepened. My understanding has deepened. So, but being involved in using writing in order to convince people of something, that's a big part of my learning. So I think the thing I would ask people to remember from this or think about from this is think about the ways that even the smallest kids can be contributing if they're included and if their efforts are appreciated.
Wow. Well, Dr. Barbara Rogoff, thank you so much.
Thank you for including me here.
That was a fascinating conversation with Dr. Barbara Rogoff. If you enjoyed this conversation, I hope you'll come back and subscribe to the Science of Learning podcast, follow, like the episode, and share with other people like you who are interested in learning.